Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the second fall lunch in the fall series, and today we'll be talking about team meltdowns and how to avoid them. My name is Stephanie Griffin. I'm the admissions officer for the EMBA program. On the screen, you'll see Mike Polanski and Molly McGowan, and they are leadership instructors and coaches in the EMBA program. Two quick things before I turn it over to Marty Lawler, who is the director of the EMBA. If you have any questions throughout the session, we'll try to put it right in between 12 and 12:30. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box. If we don't get to them at that time, we do have Q&A at the end. And second thing is I am recording this, so I will send this information to you afterwards, so you'll have all of the information as well as contact information for myself, Mike, and Molly. So from here, I will turn it over to you, Marty.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. So first, let me welcome Mike and Molly. Thank you for doing this for us. And secondly, I'd like to thank anybody that took some time out of their day today to attend this session. Stephanie mentioned this is our second in the fall series of information sessions. We do a fall and a spring series, and we try to select topics that have broad relevance, and this is one we think that touches both professionals and students alike, so we're looking forward to this. Our final session in November is a pretty deep dive look at our Executive MBA capstone course. While relatively hard to be kind of unique in this space, we think we have a somewhat distinctive capstone sequence and a capstone process. This is a real messy, real-world engagement with a client company, pretty big project, lasts for about 24 weeks, and we think it's a nice way to finish the program, tying in many of the earlier courses. Jeff Davis, our Associate Director of Executive Programs, will be the presenter for that one. So right now, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have two speakers today, as you noted. First off, Molly McGowan. We're lucky to have Molly here. Molly is a lecturer in management and the founding director of the Leadership Institute at RIT. She also manages the Saunders Leadership Enterprise, and they provide coaching and leadership development programs to individuals and companies. And we've got Mike Polanski. Mike's an associate professor of management, a recognized expert on leader integrity, and the 360-degree assessment process. And Mike did our session, I guess I should move to Mike. Mike did our session last month on the 360 process, and we do some, his research has actually extended the normal 360 process, so that was quite an interesting presentation. Both Mike and Molly are very actively involved in our executive MBA program, as Stephanie mentioned. They both teach leadership course and leadership development skills, and the latter is a sequence of courses where they basically coach executives as they're moving through the program and help them develop both personal and professional development plans. So both of these instructors are very well suited to this topic of team dysfunction, because somewhere along the line, I think you must have had an example or two of these. And I think with that, I'll just pass it over to the two of you, and you can have at it.
All right. Well, thanks, Marty and Stephanie, and we're certainly glad to be here with some folks live right now, and then archive for the future. What we want to do for the next 20 minutes or so is just talk about a few big questions that are revolve around teamwork. So specifically, what is challenging about teamwork? In other words, why is it the highest of highs and the lowest of lows many times? What do high-performing teams look like? What are some of the characteristics for those? And then also, how do we make teamwork better? How can we avoid the big meltdowns and get on the path to functioning so that teams do what they're supposed to do, which is outperform individuals? Because if they didn't, we wouldn't work in teams. So that's what we're gonna work on here today.
I would just add, in reality, it's not easy doing teamwork and having high performing teams. It takes work, and we all need some help sometimes.
There we go. All right. So we're going to base our talk around this model, which is a book by Patrick Lencioni called "The Five Dysfunctions of a Team." Some of you may have heard this. It was continues actually to be very popular, popular press market. To looking at this, and what's good about it is kind of his taxonomy here with 5 different dysfunctions. We're going to spend time today talking about the bottom 2, trust and conflict, because those really form the foundations. And I think we both agree in preparing for this that when we are called upon to perform an intervention for a low-performing team, I don't know about you, I'd probably spend at least 80 or 90% of the time talking about those.
Absolutely.
And the ones on top are just kind of the icing on the cake a lot of times.
And I really love this model because it's practical. I use it all the time when I'm coaching teams or working with different groups. And it's just easy to understand and to use it and to put to work. The other bonus that I like is it comes with a free team assessment, which is always a bonus when you can get something free. And it's just a great tool for assessing where your team is at in terms of the model, looking at your strengths and looking at your blind spots or your weaknesses as well. When I use this with different teams, what I find is that teams can be all over the map in terms of the dysfunctions. It could be trust, it could be commitment, inattention to results. But it does, as Mike said, it starts with trust. I don't think I've worked with a team yet that doesn't have some trust issues that then impact the rest of the triangle, the rest of the dysfunctions.
So let's take a look at that a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about trust. Trust is a very interesting concept. If we had to put a definition on it, it would boil down to a willingness to be vulnerable. So if you think about what trust is in any relationship, trust with a spouse or a loved one, trust with a friend, trusting your brokerage house to manage your money well. In all of those situations, there's an element of vulnerability. I'm opening myself to being hurt by trusting. But it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important in really in all human relationships, but especially those in the workplace, and doubly so on teams. As I mentioned here, it's really hard to overstate its importance. A lot of the research that I do with leadership and with teams always focuses on trust. Trust is a central idea no matter what we're dealing with. So it's really important. And the reason why it's so important is, think about it the opposite way. What happens when it's not there? As I mentioned here, team functioning disappears and it becomes a big game of CYA, cover your assets, I guess would be the polite way of saying it. But without that trust, without that willingness to be vulnerable to one another on a team, we spend most of our time trying to figure out, how do I protect me and what I'm interested in? And rightly so. I don't think we can blame people for that. But I think anybody, we reflect back on a team that we've been on that hasn't functioned, it was that. What can I get out of this? Or even if you walk in saying, I want to put aside my own self-interest for the good of the team, pretty soon, when no one else is doing that, it's hard. You can only put yourself out there so many times.
Absolutely. And I think without trust, you can't have good conflict then. And if you think about that model that we just showed, conflict is the next step up. So we have that foundational base of trust, and when we have that, then we can have good, healthy conflict, which gets to creativity, innovation, high productivity. But when we're lacking trust, that conflict can turn bad pretty quick. So we want to talk about conflict for just a little bit. So I'm sure you can all relate. Anybody out there have some conflict on a team? I can imagine you all have your own stories to share. When conflict is bad, it becomes personal pretty quickly, and nothing gets solved. I was working with a team just last night that really struggling in terms of being able to have good, healthy conflict because there's a lack of trust. People aren't willing to go deep. People aren't willing to be honest, and they focus on personality, sometimes issues, instead of getting to problem solving. So it becomes an environment of blaming and what's wrong, and the conflict is all about what's not working and whose fault it is, versus let's get to healthy conflict. Like if we trust one another, then we can be open with one another. we can focus on what's going on with our responsibilities. What can we do differently to get the task accomplished? What's going on with our process? Maybe we need to change systems or the way we operate or the way we do things. So being able to get to that healthy conflict is critical, because without it, we don't solve problems. So being able to focus on the task-related issues, the process, how we do business, how we're working together, and then also the interpersonal is a piece of that. And I can imagine that you all, just like we do, have certain personalities that may be difficult for you to work with sometimes, right? So we all have our own way of operating and getting things done and communicating, and sometimes our way of operating is completely different than someone else on the team, and that can lead to that distrust. So I think the foundational component in this is you have to invest the time and effort in building trust first, and a piece of that is taking the time to learn about people's operating principles, their values, how they like to communicate, how they like to lead, and have an open and honest conversation about that. Because sometimes we have to adapt our personalities or our communication style to get a better result. And some great tools for that, if you haven't heard them or used them already, one of my personal favorites that I use a lot with teams and really gets a good response is the DISC assessment, which stands for 4 different types of behavior patterns: dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. And just taking the time to understand what's important to people and where they're coming from can make a big difference. Or just spending time talking about team values. What are the values that we're going to commit to? Are we going to listen to each other? Are we going to put out our honest opinions? Are we going to be on time? Are we going to follow the agenda? So just thinking about what are our values and operating principles as a team can help us get to that good conflict instead of that bad conflict.
Yeah, and just to expand that a bit more, when we look at conflict and the research that's been done on conflict, generally conflict in teams boils down to one of 3 types, and Molly's kind of mentioned these already. The first one is task conflict.
Mm-hmm.
It's conflict around what is it that we're actually supposed to be doing in this team, what is the goal of the team. And sometimes that gets lost in the mix of why are we even here? And so when we have different conceptualizations about what we're trying to accomplish, that's going to lead to conflict. The second one is process conflict. Even if we all agree on the same goal, how do we go about achieving that goal? Are we going to sit down face to face once a week for 3 hours? Or are we going to have a quick 10-minute meeting and then follow up electronically? Are we going to delegate, or are we going to assign tasks to different people? We're going to have one strong leader, or are we going to share that leadership function among all of us? All of those types of questions have to do with the process. Now, what the research on conflict shows, and to me this is very exciting because it's very helpful, task conflict and process conflict are both functional types of conflict. In other words, these are good types of conflict to have, as long as they're not at too high of a level. So if you have a small amount or an intermediate amount of task or process conflict, this will actually tend to lead to better team outcomes. This is healthy. This is stuff that we want to do. Now, sometimes we get people in teams that as soon as you say conflict, no, I'm not that kind of person. I don't like conflict. If you want to be an effective team member, you've got to be comfortable with certain types of conflict, and these are the 2 that we want. The third one, though, is interpersonal conflict, and this is almost always dysfunctional. When it crosses over into the realm of personality clashes and just not liking people, this is never going to lead to a good outcome. But ironically, the dysfunctional teams spend a lot of time dealing with the experiencing interpersonal conflict, but not dealing with it. And they avoid doing the healthy conflict, task and process. Sometimes they even avoid number 3, where they're having interpersonal conflict.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mike, actually, if I can ask a question right now, we just got a question, and it's related to what you were just talking about, which is, can you give an example of a task or process conflict?
Sure. So a task conflict would be concerning what the goal of the team is, or what you're trying to accomplish. So if you're put on a work team to to improve customer service, for instance. What does that really mean? Are you trying to identify a metric that you want to use, so your customer satisfaction score, for instance? Or is it identifying that metric and addressing the root causes of what you're trying to do in terms of reducing or improving customer satisfaction? If half the people think we're just here to identify it and measure it, but the other half think, no, our job is to actually identify the root causes and address those and fix those, that's a task conflict.
Yeah, and process conflicts happen all the time, right? In terms of how we operate, what our expectations are for working with one another. Um, how does everybody contribute to the conversation? Is there an agenda for the meeting, and are we following the agenda? Are people showing up on time to the meeting, or are they showing up late to the meeting? And how does that impact everybody else in the room? You know, when important decisions are being made, does everybody get a voice and people really get a chance to discuss different ideas, or does someone dominate the group and take control, and decisions always seem to go one way? So the process there can be a lot, and again, these can be easy fixes if we don't move into the blame phase, and instead look at problem solving, and let's clarify what we mean by the task, what processes we want to operate by.
Does that help?
Great. Yes, thank you. We have additional questions, but we'll leave those to the end.
Okay, great. So we've kind of identified the realm of where some of these problems come in, but the next logical question is, well, what can I do about it? As a team member, or as a team leader especially, what can I do? The first thing is, although trust is in the eye of the beholder, just as I can't make someone else love me, I can't make someone else trust me, but there are things that I can do to be trustworthy. And not surprisingly, there's a good bit of research about this as well. There are actually three main things that we can do to prove ourselves to be trustworthy to other people. And they're easy to remember if we remember the acronym ACT, A-C-T. So I always like to tell my students, if you want to be trustworthy, you've got to act. Right? So the A is ability. In order to be trustworthy, you've got to show ability, technical ability, in whatever area it is. If someone wants to trust me on leadership assessment, I have some expertise there. I know what I'm talking about. If someone wants to trust me to lead their orchestra, it doesn't matter how great of a guy I am or how much I smile. My musical ability is off the charts low. All right, so I'm never going to have that ability there. So the ability. The second thing, the C, is character, and that's having a sense of benevolence. People want to know that you care about them, and also a sense of integrity, that you will do what you say you're going to do, that the promises that you make, you keep, that the values that you talk about as being important, you actually act like those are really important. So you've got to have that consistency between word and action. And then the T is transparency. So being open and honest about sharing information, and also giving some insight into your thought process where it's appropriate. People will cut a lot of slack if you're making an unpopular decision, but you give some insight. If you've done your homework and you can demonstrate that, they might not agree with the decision, but they're going to respect you for it. So what can we do? We can be trustworthy. We can act. Ability, character, transparency. And at the same time, we need to expect that from other people, that they're demonstrating those three things as well.
And in terms of the conflict side, I think a critical piece is addressing the elephants in the room. So often when I get called as a consultant or a coach to go in and do some work with a team, it's because there's some problem, there's some issue that no one really wants to talk about, or people are talking about it offline, or in small groups instead of as a whole team. And so not addressing that elephant, what happens? It gets bigger and bigger until, lo and behold, you have the team meltdown. So having the courage, I think, is critical to say, there's an elephant in the room and we really need to address this. And honestly, that takes strong leadership. We were just discussing a team I was involved with last night before this webinar today, and I was saying one of the struggles with this group is there's a lack of strong leadership, with no one holding the team accountable, with no one addressing the elephant in the room and saying these are challenges we need to face. The dysfunction continues over and over. So it takes courage, it takes strong leadership. You have to address those elephants in the room. And the other piece of it is, I think, being proactive versus reactive. I think often we're so busy in the day-to-day of, our work situation. We're focused on the task at hand and our to-do list and what we have to do, that we forget about being proactive. Like, we're always reacting to things or putting out fires. But to have really strong, high-performing teams, to turn those dysfunctions into functions, it takes intentional effort. So being proactive, taking time to understand the values of your team members, taking time to understand personalities. Just imagine if you knew what people's needs were, right? So everybody communicates differently. They have different things that they need from a person for trust. So taking the time up front to find out, what do people need on your team, and how can you address that as the leader? So making time up front, investing in the team process and relationships up front, being intentional, having courage, addressing the elephant in the room, and taking time to assess from time to time. Teams take work, all year long. So every so often, how you're functioning as a team is important.
Mhm. There's just no substitute for that. I think the single best piece of advice I was ever given about leadership was the following. Leadership is hard work. Do the hard work.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies for teams. Teams are hard work at times.
Yeah.
Now, I think we've all had experiences where we've been part of a team where it didn't feel like hard work. We just clicked and functioned at a very high level. Sometimes that happens almost spontaneously, but most of the time it doesn't. I think about every sports movie you've ever seen. I was showing the movie Miracle about the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team in class yesterday. The people on that team did not start off clicking at all, but over time they were able to forge into a high-performing team. Right. But it takes effort. I've got a team that I'm working with now in this program, the online EMBA, where there was some process conflict about how the work is going to get done. And this is a relatively new team. They were able to talk some things out. But I was talking to one of the members, and this particular member said, yeah, we had a conversation. We kind of got everything out on the table, so now we're fine. We're all adults, and we'll be fine. And I'm hopeful that that's the case, but my advice back was, that's wonderful, but in 4 weeks, schedule a time to check in. You've got to talk about it. So if you assume things are fine, you're really opening yourself up to some risk.
Yeah. And I would just say, don't be afraid to call for help, whether that's internally within your organization or certainly at Saunders, we can offer some assistance. There's a lot of great tools out there, a lot of great books. So just keep educating yourself as well, and sometimes you need an outside help manage that elephant in the room.
Mike and Molly, thank you so much for that. We've actually got a number of good questions that have come in. One came in, and it's related to what you were both just talking about in terms of it's hard work, putting in the effort up front. Can you talk about using team contracts, if teams use these, and if so, when is it a good idea to use those?
Yeah, that's a great question.
We love the team contracts.
Yeah, team contracts. Team contracts are very simple, or they can be very simple. They can be complex, but most of the time, simple works better. A team contract should be a 1 or 2 page document. It doesn't need to be longer than that. And on a team contract, the team members should list their individual goals for what they expect out of the team. You should agree upon team goals. So those goal conversations map right back onto that task conflict, so that's healthy. It should talk about how the team's going to function. When will you meet? How will you contact one another? When are things due? All of those types of nuts and bolts types of things, which is the process conflict. What will happen when somebody doesn't follow through, misses a deadline, heaven forbid becomes known as the slacker? What are you going to do with that person? What are the interventions? And so you talk about those things ahead of time. And what's useful then is, 2 things. One, the fact that you have talked through them already will tend to take care of a lot of the problems, and the problems will never appear.
Right.
But when they do, now you've got a piece of paper to look at and can say, you know what, we already agreed this is how we're going to handle it. And all of a sudden the piece of paper is the bad guy, not the person who's enforcing what's on the piece of paper.
Right. And I would just say, a big piece of that too is discussing your operating values. What's going to be most important for this particular team to be successful in terms of how we communicate, how we address one another, how we deal with conflict.
A follow-up question to that. In your experience, are people comfortable going to leadership to help resolve a conflict if there is one, or is that viewed as a weakness and they don't want to go to leadership?
It's a dicey one. I think part of it depends on the relationship with the leadership and the culture of the organization, and whether it's seen as, the leadership is supportive in helping process and work through, conflicts and challenges, or if it's seen as weakness. So I think it depends on the culture of the organization to some extent.
It's a tough one, and I think it absolutely depends on that, the organizational culture and the particular person that they would be going to for that help.
Right.
And as a leader, that presents a real challenge, a real dilemma. On one hand, as a leader, you want to model needing help, really, and being able to work through those things and to seek outside help. At the same time, though, you need to do so in an appropriate way, so you're not airing all the dirty laundry at the upper levels of the company.
Yeah.
So there's a delicate balance there, but ultimately that leader needs to role model that. Help is a good thing, not a bad thing.
And the other option, again, is to bring in a neutral outside party, an external facilitator who can help maybe be a sounding board or can provide some tools or resources.
Okay, so would you say then that leadership style is pretty closely coupled to team effectiveness in terms of setting that example?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
No doubt
pretty
about it.
straightforward. We actually have another pretty straightforward question too, which is just in your experience, and we have about a minute for this, is there an optimal team size?
Depends on what you're trying to do, but I've said it several times, but here again it applies. There's actually quite a bit of research on teams that shows that the optimal team size for most business tasks is 5 to 7 people, and you want 5 or 7, not 6, if you can avoid it. That's a big enough group to be able to get a diversity. We haven't talked much about diversity here, but a diversity of experienced opinions, backgrounds, ways of looking at things, and that's where the real benefits from teams comes in when you do have that diversity. So it gives a diversity, it gives enough hands to actually do the work, but it's not so big that it's becomes cumbersome, and it's kind of hard to be a slacker. It's kind of hard to sit in the back row when there's only 5 or 6 or 7 people. So that's the usual optimal size.
Yeah, I would just add that the bigger the team, the more likely some of the dysfunction can creep in. So it's just harder to manage.
Yeah.
Mike and Molly, thank you very much. You both instruct students in the EMBA program and work with teams there on a daily basis and weekly basis, touching base with them. Real quickly, I just want to touch on the Executive MBA program. There are 2 models for the delivering this. There's an online program, starts January and August of each year, and then there's an on-campus program here at the RIT campus, and that's every other Friday and Saturday for 15 months. Even with the online program, with both programs, there is an orientation at the start of the program. So even for online, because there is so much teamwork in the program and exactly what you're talking about today, people come together and meet each other in person before classes start, and we do those team contracts so that people can refer to them later on down the road instead of making it personal. They have those contracts. The program is a cohort format, so the curriculum builds on itself. It's a set structure. Everybody starts together, finishes together, and goes through the whole program as a cohort unit. There is an emphasis on global business. It's weaved throughout the curriculum, but then during the last semester, there is a week-long international seminar trip. They just came back from Poland. Marty just came back 2 weeks ago from Poland for that trip. And then also, as you can see, leadership is an emphasis. There are 5 courses on leadership or leadership development within the program. The next cohort begins in January of 2016, and then that's for online. And then next August, we have online and on campus starting. So any questions, Mike and Molly, thank you for making your contact information available. If anyone has questions on what you've talked about today or team dynamics, they can get in touch with you that way. Again, I will be sending this out, so you'll have all of this information to reference. Thanks again for attending. Thank you, Mike and Molly. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, to attending. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.